5 years ago, on a bitterly cold November afternoon in 2018, 16-year-old Dylan Mitchell vanished without a trace after leaving Jefferson High School in Springfield, Ohio. The promising honor student, known for his infectious laugh and dreams of studying journalism at Northwestern University, simply walked out of his AP history class at 3:47 p.m. and disappeared into the grey autumn mist that had settled over the small Midwestern town like a suffocating blanket. He left behind his navy blue backpack containing his unfinished essay on the Great Depression, his college preparation books meticulously highlighted in yellow and pink, his dreams of becoming an investigative reporter, and a family whose world would shatter into pieces that could never be fully reassembled. The disappearance plunged his parents, Sarah and Michael Mitchell, into a nightmare that would consume every waking moment for the next 5 years. Sarah, a soft-spoken bank manager who had always believed in the fundamental goodness of the world, found herself unable to sleep without prescription medication, her nights haunted by visions of her son calling out for help from places she couldn't reach. Michael, a steady insurance adjuster who prided himself on solving problems through methodical analysis, discovered that his professional skills were useless against the chaotic reality of a missing child. Their younger daughter Emma, then only 12 years old and Dylan's devoted little sister, grew up in the shadow of her missing brother's empty bedroom, which Sarah kept exactly as he had left it, down to the unmade bed and the half-finished history homework still spread across his desk. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The community of Springfield, a town of 60,000 people where everyone knew everyone else's business, rallied around the Mitchell family with the kind of support that small-town America prides itself on. Hundreds of volunteers organized search parties that combed through the dense woods surrounding the town, distributed missing person flyers with Dylan's smiling senior photo on every street corner, telephone pole and business window, and held candlelight vigils in the town square that drew crowds of mourners who had watched Dylan grow up from a gap-toothed little boy into a promising young man. Local businesses donated money for private investigators. The high school football team dedicated their entire season to finding their former teammate, and the town's churches organized prayer chains that continued for months, then years, as hope gradually transformed into a more desperate kind of faith. The police investigation, led by Detective Patricia Hawkins, a 20-year veteran of missing persons cases who had seen too many families destroyed by unanswered questions, explored every conceivable possibility with the thoroughness that such cases demanded. They investigated the theory that Dylan had run away, despite his close relationship with his family and his excitement about his upcoming college applications. They pursued the possibility of abduction, following every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius and investigating reports of suspicious vehicles in the area around his disappearance. They examined the darkest scenarios that no parent wants to contemplate, including the possibility that Dylan had taken his own life, despite having no history of depression or mental health issues and having made concrete plans for his future that extended well beyond his disappearance date. Security cameras throughout Springfield captured Dylan's final known movements with mechanical precision that felt almost mocking in its clarity. He was seen leaving Jefferson High School through the main entrance at exactly 3:47 p.m., his stride confident and purposeful, showing no signs of distress or awareness that he was walking toward a fate that would consume his family's lives. He stopped at Henderson's corner store at 3:52 p.m., purchasing a bottle of water and a package of gum, making small talk with the elderly proprietor about the upcoming basketball season. The store's security footage showed him laughing at something Mr. Henderson said, his demeanor completely normal and relaxed. After that, Dylan Mitchell seemed to vanish from the earth itself, as if the universe had simply decided to erase him from existence. His cell phone, A slightly cracked iPhone that contained the digital footprints of a normal teenager's life was discovered 3 days later in a drainage ditch approximately 2 miles from the school, water damaged beyond repair and offering no clues about what had happened to its owner. The phone's last ping had been traced to a cell tower near the outskirts of town, but the signal had died before investigators could narrow down a more specific location. Digital forensics experts from the state police examined the device for weeks, but the water damage had corrupted most of the data, leaving only fragments of text messages about homework assignments and plans to attend a friend's birthday party the following weekend, plans that Dylan would never be able to keep. The investigation consumed enormous resources and manpower, with Detective Hawkins working 18-hour days and following up on hundreds of tips that poured in from across the state and beyond. Every lead was pursued with meticulous care. Reported sightings in distant cities, anonymous phone calls claiming knowledge of Dylan's whereabouts, psychic visions that promised to reveal hidden truths, and online conspiracy theories that suggested everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. But as weeks turned to months and months stretched into years, the harsh reality of missing persons investigations began to assert itself. New cases demanded attention and resources. The media spotlight moved on to fresh tragedies, and Dylan's file gradually migrated to the shelf marked cold cases, a bureaucratic limbo where hope goes to die slowly and painfully. His family never stopped believing he would come home, organizing annual vigils on the anniversary of his disappearance that drew smaller and smaller crowds as the years passed. They maintained a Facebook page called Bring Dylan Home that chronicled their unwavering faith through daily posts, sharing memories of their son and brother, pleading for information from anyone who might have seen him, and refusing to use the past tense when speaking about Dylan's life. Sarah started a support group for families of missing persons that met in the basement of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, where parents shared their grief and desperate hope with others who understood the unique torture of not knowing whether their child was alive or dead, suffering or at peace. The years of silence were punctuated only by false hopes that arrived like cruel gifts, raising the family's spirits before dashing them against the rocks of disappointment. Every unidentified body discovered in Ohio or neighboring states sent the Mitchells into a spiral of terror and relief that left them emotionally exhausted and psychologically scarred. Every supposed sighting, a young man matching Dylan's description at a gas station in Toledo, a teenager boarding a Greyhound bus in Cincinnati, a college-age boy working at a construction site in Pittsburgh, led to frantic phone calls, desperate drives across state lines, and inevitable dead ends that felt like small deaths, each one chipping away at the family's ability to maintain hope in the face of relentless uncertainty. Sarah Mitchell made the devastating decision to quit her position as a bank manager, a career she had built over 15 years and genuinely loved, to dedicate herself entirely to finding her missing son. She spent her days hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table, combing through online forums dedicated to missing persons cases, contacting psychics and mediums who promised to commune with Dylan's spirit, following every lead no matter how far-fetched or expensive it proved to be. She learned the language of private investigators and hired 3 different firms over the years, spending the family's savings and retirement funds on professionals who ultimately produced the same result: more questions and no answers. Michael threw himself into his work with a single-minded intensity that his colleagues found both admirable and deeply concerning. He took on extra cases, worked weekends and holidays, and accumulated overtime hours that would have made him wealthy under different circumstances. But those who knew him well noticed the profound changes that grief had carved into his character. The way his hair had turned completely grey within 2 years of Dylan's disappearance, how his ready smile had vanished entirely, and how he seemed to age a decade in the span of months. The family's marriage, once a source of strength and mutual support, strained under the weight of shared loss and different coping mechanisms, held together only by their mutual determination to bring Dylan home and their shared refusal to give up when everyone else had moved on to other tragedies and fresher mysteries. March 2020 brought a different kind of disappearance to America and the world beyond. The sudden, shocking vanishing of normal life as the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe like a digital age plague, forcing entire nations into lockdown and transforming every aspect of human existence in ways that no one could have anticipated. For the Mitchell family, already intimately familiar with loss and isolation, the pandemic added another suffocating layer of loneliness to their already profound sense of abandonment by a world that seemed to have forgotten their missing son. The annual vigil for Dylan, held every November 15th in Springfield's Town Square, was cancelled for the first time in 5 years due to social distancing requirements, robbing the family of their most important ritual of remembrance and community support. The support group meetings that had become Sarah's lifeline were forced to migrate to awkward video calls that lacked the intimate comfort of physical presence and shared grief. Parents who had found solace in hugging each other and sharing tissues now stared at small rectangles on computer screens, their sorrow pixelated and delayed by poor internet connections. The pandemic seemed to erase Dylan even more completely from public consciousness, as the world became obsessed with immediate survival rather than old mysteries that had no clear solutions. Missing person cases that predated the pandemic suddenly seemed like ancient history, relics from a time when people had the luxury of caring about tragedies that didn't directly threaten their own mortality. Jefferson High School, like educational institutions across the country, scrambled desperately to adapt to remote learning protocols that no one had ever tested on such a massive scale. Teachers who had built their careers on face-to-face interaction with students suddenly found themselves broadcasting lessons from their kitchen tables, spare bedrooms, and hastily converted home offices, struggling with technology they barely understood while trying to maintain some semblance of educational continuity for teenagers who were just as confused and frightened as the adults attempting to guide them. Mrs. Henderson, Dylan's former AP history teacher and one of the educators who had known him best during his time at Jefferson High, epitomized the challenges facing teachers during this unprecedented transition. A woman in her late 50s who had always prided herself on her ability to connect with students through passionate storytelling and animated classroom discussions, she now found herself staring at a computer screen, talking to black rectangles with names like Emma M. and Jake 2003, trying to recreate the magic of historical narrative through a medium that seemed designed to eliminate human connection rather than foster it. The technological learning curve was steep and frustrating for educators who had built their teaching methods around physical presence, eye contact, and the subtle cues that come from sharing space with other human beings. Mrs. Henderson spent her evenings watching YouTube tutorials on video conferencing software, practicing her lessons in front of her laptop camera, and troubleshooting audio issues that made her sound like she was broadcasting from the bottom of a swimming pool. Her husband helped set up a makeshift classroom in their den, complete with a whiteboard positioned behind her chair and proper lighting that wouldn't cast unflattering shadows across her face during lessons. The students, meanwhile, struggled with their own technological and emotional challenges. Many lacked reliable internet connections, forcing them to join classes from parking lots outside libraries and fast food restaurants where free Wi-Fi was available. Others shared computers with siblings and parents who were also working from home, creating scheduling conflicts that made consistent attendance nearly impossible. The digital divide, previously an abstract concern for policymakers, became a harsh reality that determined which students could continue their education and which would simply disappear from the academic radar entirely. The transition to virtual learning was chaotic, imperfect, and plagued by technical difficulties that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Video calls frozen at unfortunate moments, creating accidental screenshot memes of teachers caught mid-sneeze or students appearing to make rude gestures when they were simply adjusting their cameras. Audio feedback loops that created ear-splitting screeches, forcing everyone to mute their microphones and communicate through frantic typing in chat boxes. Internet connections that dropped at crucial moments, cutting off important explanations mid-sentence and leaving students to guess at assignments they had only partially heard. Parent permission slips for online learning had been rushed through during the early days of the pandemic, often signed without careful review by families who were juggling impossible combinations of work-from-home arrangements, childcare responsibilities, and their own health concerns. School districts, desperate to maintain some form of educational continuity, had prioritized speed over security in their technological implementations, creating systems that were functional but not necessarily foolproof. The result was a virtual learning environment that operated more like the Wild West of education, largely unsupervised, minimally regulated, and vulnerable to intrusions that no one had anticipated when emergency remote learning protocols were hastily implemented. In this atmosphere of confusion, adaptation, and barely controlled chaos, strange occurrences seemed not just possible, but almost inevitable. Teachers reported mysterious background voices during their lessons, unexpected participants joining class sessions without proper credentials, and cameras that activated themselves seemingly at random. Technical support staff were overwhelmed with reports that ranged from the mundane, forgotten passwords and microphone malfunctions, to the bizarre, classes being invaded by people claiming to be deceased relatives or fictional characters. School administrators, already stretched beyond their limits by the demands of pandemic education, treated most technological anomalies as glitches to be fixed rather than mysteries to be investigated. The focus was entirely on maintaining some semblance of educational continuity, not on exploring every digital oddity that emerged from systems that were being pushed far beyond their intended capabilities. In this environment, the impossible could masquerade as merely improbable, and genuine mysteries could be dismissed as routine technical difficulties that would resolve themselves with time and software updates. It was Tuesday morning, April 14th, 2020, a date that would forever be etched in the memory of everyone who witnessed what happened next. The spring morning was typical for Ohio, overcast skies that promised rain and a chill in the air that reminded everyone that winter's grip was only beginning to loosen. Mrs. Henderson was conducting her second-period American history class via Zoom, a routine that had become as familiar as it was unsatisfying after weeks of remote learning. Her laptop sat on the makeshift desk in her den, surrounded by the careful staging that had become necessary for virtual teaching, good lighting, a professional background, and a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The lesson was proceeding normally, if anything about pandemic education could be considered normal. Mrs. Henderson was discussing the Great Depression, drawing parallels between the economic devastation of the 1930s and the current crisis that was unfolding around them in real time. 12 students were logged into the session, their faces flickering in and out of pixelated existence on her laptop screen, like modern-day ghosts, some with cameras on, others represented only by black rectangles bearing their names. The audio quality was typically poor, with occasional feedback and the constant background noise of families living their entire lives in spaces that had never been designed for simultaneous work, education, and domestic activities. Emma Mitchell, Dylan's younger sister, and now a senior at Jefferson High School herself, was among the students in the virtual classroom, though her camera was turned off and she had been unusually quiet during the discussion. The irony of taking American history in the same virtual space where her missing brother had once learned about past tragedies was not lost on her. But 5 years of living with an absent sibling had taught her to compartmentalize grief in order to function in daily life. She was taking notes in a notebook that bore Dylan's initials, a small ritual that kept his memory present in her academic life. Mrs. Henderson was in the middle of explaining the social impact of unemployment during the Depression when her computer screen flickered slightly, a common occurrence that she had learned to ignore. But this flicker was different. Instead of the usual freeze or pixelation, her screen seemed to expand, accommodating one additional participant that materialized in the bottom right corner of the Zoom window. The appearance was so subtle and natural that it took several seconds for Mrs. Henderson to register that something impossible had just occurred. The 13th participant in her 12-person class was Dylan Mitchell, older and thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably the student who had vanished from her physical classroom nearly 2 years earlier. His image was surprisingly clear, despite the technological impossibility of his presence, showing him sitting in what appeared to be a small, dimly lit room with bare white walls and minimal furnishing visible in the background. The lighting was harsh and artificial, suggesting fluorescent bulbs rather than natural sunlight, and the space looked institutional rather than residential, more like a dormitory or office than a home where a young man might be attending school virtually. Dylan's appearance had changed significantly during his years of absence, but the fundamental features that made him recognizable remained intact. His face had lost the softness of adolescence, his jawline now sharp and defined in a way that spoke of stress and premature maturity. His hair was shorter than he had worn it in high school, cut in a practical style that lacked any personal flair or fashion consciousness. Most striking were his eyes. Still the same pale blue that his mother had always said reminded her of winter sky, but now carrying a weight of experience that was both profound and deeply troubling. He wasn't speaking, which was not unusual in a virtual classroom where students often kept their microphones muted to avoid disrupting the lesson with background noise. But there was something intentional about his silence, as if he was listening carefully, not just to Mrs. Henderson's lesson about the Great Depression, but to something else entirely, perhaps monitoring his own environment for sounds or activities that might indicate danger or discovery. His posture was alert but tense, like someone who had learned to be constantly vigilant, never fully relaxed even in moments of apparent safety. The other students noticed Dylan's presence with varying degrees of recognition and shock. Sarah Chen, who had been Dylan's lab partner in AP chemistry during their junior year, was the first to react, her sharp intake of breath audible over her open microphone. She had been doodling in her notebook while listening to Mrs. Henderson's lecture, but Dylan's sudden appearance caused her to drop her pen and lean closer to her computer screen, her eyes widening as she processed what she was seeing. Marcus Thompson, who had sat behind Dylan in multiple classes and had been part of the same friend group that played pickup basketball games after school, began typing furiously in the chat box before remembering to unmute himself to speak. "Is that really Dylan?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he asked the question that was forming in everyone's minds. "Oh my God, is that really him?" The chat box exploded with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and rapid-fire questions as students tried to process what they were seeing. Some participants thought it must be a cruel prank orchestrated by someone with advanced technical skills and a twisted sense of humor. Others wondered if they were experiencing some form of collective hallucination brought on by the stress and isolation of pandemic life. But those students who had known Dylan well during his time at Jefferson High recognized subtle details that would have been impossible for an imposter to replicate. Emma Mitchell, who had been quietly taking notes when her missing brother appeared on screen, felt the world tilt on its axis in a way that was both terrifying and wonderful. For 5 years, she had dreamed of seeing Dylan's face again, imagining reunion scenarios that ranged from joyful homecomings to tragic discoveries. But she had never envisioned this, her brother's image flickering on a computer screen during a mundane history lesson, looking older and somehow damaged by experiences she could only guess at. Her first instinct was to scream, to call out his name, to demand answers to questions that had haunted her family for years. But something in Dylan's demeanor, a subtle tension in his posture, a wariness in his eyes, suggested that drawing attention to his presence might not be safe for him. Mrs. Henderson's teacher training had prepared her for many classroom challenges: disruptive students, technical difficulties, sensitive historical topics that required careful navigation, even active shooter scenarios that had become an unfortunate reality of modern education. But nothing in her professional experience had equipped her to handle the sudden appearance of a student who had been missing for nearly 2 years, especially when that appearance violated every law of physics and technology that she understood. Her heart began pounding so hard that she could hear it in her ears, and her hands trembled as she tried to maintain some semblance of professional composure while processing information that challenged her understanding of reality itself. The moment stretched beyond normal time, filled with a tension that was both electric and terrifying. Mrs. Henderson found herself staring directly at Dylan through her computer screen, their eyes meeting across whatever impossible distance separated them. She called his name tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow shatter whatever fragile connection had brought him into her virtual classroom. "Dylan Mitchell, is that really you?" For a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting. Dylan seemed to focus specifically on Mrs. Henderson, his eyes brightening with recognition and something that might have been relief. His lips moved slightly, forming words that no one could hear because his audio feed remained silent. The movement was deliberate and repeated, as if he was trying to communicate something crucial but was unable or afraid to activate his microphone. His expression conveyed urgency mixed with a deep, bone-deep weariness that spoke of experiences no young person should have to endure. Then, as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared, Dylan's image began to deteriorate. The picture became pixelated, breaking apart into digital fragments that scattered across the screen like pieces of a puzzle being dissolved. His face froze for a moment in an expression that could have been desperation or determination, his mouth open as if he had finally found the courage to speak. Then the image collapsed entirely, leaving behind only empty space in the Zoom window and the echoing silence of 12 people who had just witnessed something that logic said was impossible, but their eyes insisted was real. The virtual classroom erupted into chaos as students unmuted their microphones simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions, theories, and emotional reactions. Some were crying, others were shouting, and a few had apparently left the session entirely, overwhelmed by what they had just experienced. Mrs. Henderson, her professional training finally kicking in despite her personal shock, tried to restore order while her own mind raced to process the implications of what had just occurred. Now, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented reports reach. Within minutes of Dylan's disappearance from the virtual classroom, Mrs. Henderson was simultaneously trying to calm her panicked students while reaching for her cell phone with shaking hands. The school administration needed to be notified immediately, but how do you explain the impossible to people who deal in attendance records and curriculum standards? Her first call was to Principal Rodriguez, a pragmatic man in his early 60s who had been running Jefferson High School for over a decade and prided himself on his ability to handle any crisis with calm efficiency and rational problem-solving. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Janet Henderson. I need you to listen to me very carefully because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I have 12 student witnesses who can corroborate everything. Her voice was shaking despite her efforts to maintain professional composure, and she found herself speaking rapidly, afraid that if she slowed down, she might lose the courage to report something that sounded like the product of a stress-induced breakdown rather than objective reality. Principal Rodriguez's initial response was exactly what Mrs. Henderson had expected: polite skepticism mixed with concern for a valued teacher who might be experiencing some form of pandemic-induced psychological crisis. The stress of remote learning had taken a toll on many educators, and reports of technical difficulties, virtual pranks, and even mild hallucinations were not uncommon in the spring of 2020. However, his skepticism began to dissolve as Mrs. Henderson provided specific details about Dylan's appearance, details that aligned perfectly with the missing student he remembered from 2 years earlier. The situation escalated rapidly as students began calling their parents, many of whom were working from home and immediately available to take calls from children who were clearly upset about something extraordinary that had happened during their online class. Within 30 minutes of Dylan's appearance, the school's main office phone lines were flooded with calls from parents demanding explanations for something that sounded too bizarre to be real, but too specific to be dismissed as mass hysteria or technical malfunction. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself fielding calls from parents who ranged from concerned to angry to completely bewildered. Some demanded to know how the school's security systems had been compromised to allow such a cruel prank. Others wanted reassurance that their children were safe if someone was indeed capable of infiltrating virtual classrooms without authorization. A few asked if the school district was conducting some form of psychological experiment on students without proper parental consent. The most difficult calls came from parents who had known Dylan personally and were torn between hope and skepticism about what their children claimed to have witnessed. The school district's IT department, led by technology coordinator James Walsh, was summoned to Jefferson High School with the urgency typically reserved for genuine emergencies. Walsh, a man in his 40s who had transitioned from private sector cybersecurity to educational technology support, arrived at the school expecting to find a routine case of virtual classroom intrusion, a problem that had become increasingly common as hackers and pranksters discovered the vulnerabilities in hastily implemented remote learning systems. However, as Walsh began his technical investigation, he quickly realized that this case defied every category of cyber intrusion he had encountered in his 15-year career. The Zoom session logs showed 13 participants for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, but only 12 registered accounts had been authorized for the class. The phantom 13th participant had no associated email address, no user profile, and no record of invitation or admission to the session. Most puzzling of all, the additional presence hadn't triggered any of the security alerts that should have activated when unauthorized users attempted to join protected educational sessions. Walsh spent the next several hours analyzing server logs, IP addresses, and connection data with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him successful in the private cybersecurity sector. He examined firewall logs, traced network pathways, and consulted with technical support specialists from Zoom's corporate headquarters, who were equally baffled by the technical impossibility of what appeared to have occurred. The phantom participant seemed to exist in a digital void, present enough to be seen and recorded by witnesses, but absent from every technical system that should have documented his connection. The deeper Walsh dug into the technical evidence, the more disturbed he became by the implications of what he was discovering. The phantom connection appeared to have bypassed not just Zoom's security protocols, but also the school district's firewall systems, the state educational network's authentication requirements, and even basic internet service provider logging systems that tracked all traffic flowing through Springfield's digital infrastructure. It was as if Dylan had found a way to exist in cyberspace without actually connecting to any of the networks that comprise the internet. Detective Patricia Hawkins received the call about Dylan's alleged reappearance while she was reviewing case files in her cluttered office at the Springfield Police Department, surrounded by the familiar chaos of unsolved investigations and administrative paperwork that had accumulated during the pandemic's disruption of normal police operations. Her first instinct upon hearing Mrs. Henderson's report was professional skepticism mixed with personal sympathy. Missing persons cases attracted hoaxes, false sightings, and well-meaning but mistaken witness reports with depressing regularity, and the emotional toll on families often led to wishful thinking that transformed innocent encounters into miraculous reunions. However, Detective Hawkins had never completely closed Dylan's case, and something about the specific details of Mrs. Henderson's report triggered her investigative instincts in a way that routine false sightings did not. The consistency of witness accounts, the technical sophistication required to infiltrate a protected virtual classroom, and the brevity of the encounter suggested something more complex than a simple prank or case of mistaken identity. Within 2 hours of receiving the initial report, she was driving to Jefferson High School with a sense of anticipation and dread that she had learned to trust after 20 years of investigating cases where the impossible sometimes turned out to be merely improbable. Her first interviews with the student witnesses provided details that aligned with remarkable consistency, despite the chaotic nature of the encounter and the emotional state of the people who had experienced it. Each student independently described Dylan's changed appearance, his apparent age progression, his silent behavior, and his sudden disappearance in terms that were nearly identical. More importantly, several students mentioned subtle details about Dylan's appearance and mannerisms that would have been impossible for a stranger to replicate. The way he tilted his head slightly to the left when concentrating, his habit of touching his ear when nervous, and a small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident that was barely visible but familiar to anyone who had known him well. Emma Mitchell's interview was particularly compelling and heartbreaking. As Dylan's sister, she possessed intimate knowledge of details that only family members would recognize, and her description of her brother's appearance during his virtual manifestation included observations about subtle changes in his facial structure, his posture, and his expression that spoke to years of experiences that had aged him beyond his chronological years. Her emotional response was genuine and profound, the mixture of joy, terror, and desperate hope that could not be fabricated or coached. The most disturbing aspect of all the witness accounts was their unanimous description of Dylan's behavior during his brief appearance. Rather than showing excitement, relief, or even recognition at finding himself back in contact with familiar faces from his past life, Dylan had appeared watchful, tense, and almost fearful. His attempts at communication had been subtle and cautious, as if he was aware that his presence might be monitored or that speaking openly could put him in danger. The implications were chilling. If Dylan was indeed alive and had somehow managed to briefly connect with his former classroom, his circumstances might be far more sinister than anyone had previously imagined. Sarah Mitchell was folding laundry in her living room, engaging in the mundane domestic ritual that had become one of her few sources of comfort during the long years of Dylan's absence, when her cell phone rang with news that would fundamentally alter her understanding of possibility, hope, and the nature of reality itself. The spring afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows of the house that had felt like a mausoleum for 5 years, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, oblivious to the human tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. The phone call came from Mrs. Henderson, whose trembling voice delivered information that no mother of a missing child ever expects to hear, especially not after years of silence and false leads that had gradually eroded the family's ability to maintain hope in the face of relentless uncertainty. "Sarah, I need you to sit down. I know this is going to sound impossible, but I just saw Dylan in my online class. I know how this sounds, but I'm absolutely certain it was him. He appeared in our Zoom session for several minutes, and multiple students can confirm what I'm telling you." The laundry basket fell from Sarah's hands, as if her body had forgotten how to perform basic motor functions. Clean clothes scattering across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves. Mixing with the dust and debris that had accumulated in corners, she no longer had the energy to clean thoroughly. 5 years of suppressed hope came flooding back with the force of a broken dam, overwhelming her carefully constructed emotional defenses and leaving her gasping for air as she tried to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about loss, technology, and the boundaries of what was possible in the modern world. Her first coherent thought was not joy, but terror. If Dylan was alive and had managed to somehow contact his former school, why hadn't he tried to reach his family directly? What circumstances could possibly explain his years of absence and his sudden, brief reappearance in a virtual classroom rather than in the safety of his own home? The implications were both wonderful and horrifying, suggesting that her son might be alive but trapped in circumstances that prevented him from coming home or making direct contact with the people who loved him most. Michael Mitchell was in a client meeting at his insurance office, reviewing damage assessments for a series of storm-related claims that had kept him busy for weeks, when his wife's hysterical call reached him on his work phone. Sarah's words tumbled over each other in a mixture of joy, disbelief, and maternal terror that made her nearly incomprehensible. "Michael, you need to come home right now. Dylan is alive. Mrs. Henderson saw him. He was in her virtual classroom. He looked older and different, but it was him. Multiple people saw him. I need you to drive me to the school immediately." Michael's first instinct was to assume that his wife was experiencing some form of breakdown brought on by the anniversary stress that always intensified around this time of year, combined with the additional isolation and anxiety that the pandemic had brought to their already fragile emotional state. But as Sarah continued to provide specific details about what Mrs. Henderson had reported, details that included observations about Dylan's changed appearance and the technical circumstances of his virtual manifestation, Michael began to realize that something extraordinary had occurred that demanded immediate attention and investigation. He excused himself from his meeting with a brief explanation that a family emergency required his immediate departure, driving through red lights and stop signs with the reckless urgency of a man whose carefully controlled emotional equilibrium had been shattered by the sudden reintroduction of hope into a life that had been built around the acceptance of loss. His hands shook on the steering wheel as he tried to process the implications of what Sarah had told him, alternating between desperate excitement and protective skepticism that warned him not to invest too heavily in possibilities that might prove to be cruel mirages. Emma Mitchell, now 17 and a senior at Jefferson High School herself, was in her own virtual AP literature class when her parents burst into her bedroom with news that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her family's tragedy and her own identity as the sister of a missing person. The irony of the situation was not lost on any of them. Dylan had reappeared in the same virtual educational environment where Emma was now receiving her own education, as if the digital realm had somehow become a bridge between their separate realities. Emma's reaction to the news was complex and emotionally overwhelming. For 5 years, she had lived as the surviving child of parents whose attention and energy had been consumed by their missing son's absence. She had grown up in Dylan's shadow, attending the same school where everyone knew her as the missing boy's sister. carrying the weight of her family's tragedy while trying to build her own identity and future. The possibility that Dylan might be alive created a mixture of joy and anxiety. Joy at the prospect of her brother's return, but also anxiety about how his reappearance might change the family dynamics that she had spent years learning to navigate. The family's rush to Jefferson High School was a blur of desperate hope and logical skepticism, their Honda Civic speeding through Springfield's familiar streets that now seemed charged with new possibility and meaning. Sarah clutched her purse containing the small notebook where she had recorded every detail of Dylan's disappearance, every lead that had been followed, every false hope that had been shattered. The notebook had become a tangible representation of her refusal to give up, and now it might finally serve its intended purpose as a record that would help bring her son home. The impossibility of the situation warred with the testimonies of multiple credible witnesses, creating a cognitive dissonance that left the family suspended between grief and celebration, between the acceptance of loss and the rekindling of hope that they had spent years trying to protect themselves from experiencing. Sarah had imagined Dylan's return thousands of times in different scenarios, walking through their front door with explanations and apologies, calling from a hospital with stories of memory loss and confusion, being brought home by police officers who had finally solved the mystery of his disappearance. But she had never envisioned it happening through a computer screen in a virtual classroom, mediated by technology that seemed to offer connection while maintaining impossible distance. Detective Hawkins met the family at Jefferson High School, her expression carefully neutral as she prepared them for both the extraordinary possibilities and the frustrating limitations of what had occurred. Her 20 years of experience in missing persons cases had taught her to manage families' expectations carefully, especially in situations where hope and heartbreak were separated by the thinnest of margins. She explained that while the evidence of Dylan's virtual appearance was unprecedented and compelling, it was also frustratingly intangible. Multiple credible witnesses had seen him, but he had left no digital footprint, no way to trace his location, no method of re-establishing contact. The evidence was unprecedented, but also maddeningly incomplete. The witnesses were credible and their accounts consistent, but the technical impossibility of Dylan's appearance raised questions that had no ready answers. It was as if he had found a way to reach through the internet without actually being connected to it. A technological miracle that felt more like a cruel tease than a genuine breakthrough in the case that had consumed their lives for 5 years. The most difficult aspect of the situation was the uncertainty about Dylan's current circumstances. If he was alive and had somehow managed to briefly contact his former school, why hadn't he spoken? Why had he appeared tense and watchful rather than relieved to see familiar faces? What did his changed appearance, older, thinner, more guarded, suggest about the experiences he had endured during his years of absence? The questions multiplied with each passing hour, creating a new form of torture that combined hope with dread in ways that were almost more difficult to bear than the simple grief of believing he was dead. News of Dylan's impossible virtual appearance spread through social media with the viral intensity that only the most extraordinary stories achieve in the digital age, particularly during a pandemic when millions of people were confined to their homes and hungry for any narrative that transcended the mundane reality of lockdown life. Screenshots from students' phones, though blurry and indistinct due to the poor quality of virtual classroom video feeds, began circulating on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram within hours of the incident, accompanied by hashtags like Digital Ghost, COVID Mystery, and Virtual Reunion. The story captured the public imagination with remarkable speed and intensity, combining elements that resonated powerfully with people who were themselves feeling isolated, disconnected, and desperate for human connection in ways they had never experienced before. Here was a mystery that seemed to perfectly encapsulate the surreal nature of pandemic life, the way technology had become both a lifeline and a barrier, the way virtual interactions could feel simultaneously intimate and artificial, and the way the boundaries between reality and digital existence had become increasingly blurred for everyone living through this unprecedented historical moment. Sarah Chen, who had been Dylan's lab partner in AP chemistry and one of the most articulate witnesses to his virtual appearance, posted a detailed account of the experience on her Instagram story that was screenshot and shared thousands of times within the first 24 hours. Her description of Dylan's changed appearance, his silent behavior, and the emotional impact of seeing a missing classmate after years of absence resonated with young people who were themselves grappling with isolation, loss, and the weird intimacies of virtual learning environments. Marcus Thompson created a TikTok video that attempted to recreate the moment of Dylan's appearance using screenshots and dramatic reenactment, complete with his own shocked reaction and theories about what might have happened. The video garnered over 1 million views in its first week online, sparking thousands of comments that ranged from genuine concern and sympathy to conspiracy theories and skeptical debunking attempts. The video's popularity led to a series of follow-up posts exploring missing persons cases, virtual reality theories, and the psychological impact of pandemic isolation on teenagers. The story's viral spread brought both positive and negative attention to the Mitchell family and the Springfield community. Supporters organized online fundraising campaigns to support renewed search efforts, created social media groups dedicated to sharing information about Dylan's case, and offered emotional support to a family that had been struggling with loss and uncertainty for years. However, the attention also attracted internet trolls, conspiracy theorists, and attention seekers who saw the story as an opportunity to promote their own agendas or gain followers through controversial takes on the mysterious events. National news outlets began picking up the story within 48 hours of its initial viral spread, with CNN, Fox News, NBC, and other major networks sending reporters to Springfield to investigate what media quickly dubbed the virtual classroom miracle and the COVID ghost. Now, the story offered news organizations a welcome break from the relentlessly grim coverage of pandemic deaths, economic collapse, and political turmoil that had dominated headlines for months, providing a mystery that was both compelling and relatively safe to explore without wading into controversial political territory. The media coverage brought a parade of experts offering various explanations for what had occurred. Dr. Marcus Webb, a digital forensics specialist from Ohio State University, appeared on multiple news programs to explain the technical impossibilities of the event while acknowledging that the consistency and credibility of witness accounts was unprecedented in his professional experience. His measured skepticism provided a counterbalance to more sensational interpretations of the story, but his inability to offer a definitive technical explanation only added to the mystery's appeal. Dr. Sarah Patterson, a psychologist specializing in trauma and grief counseling, offered insights into the psychological dimensions of the case, explaining how prolonged uncertainty about a missing loved one could create the conditions for both genuine hope and devastating disappointment. Her appearances on news programs helped contextualize the Mitchell family's emotional journey, while also providing educational content about the unique challenges faced by families of missing persons, particularly during the additional stresses created by pandemic isolation. Technology journalists and cybersecurity experts were consulted extensively, with most offering theories that ranged from sophisticated hacking attempts to entirely new forms of cyber intrusion that exploited vulnerabilities in hastily implemented remote learning systems. However, The technical impossibility of bypassing multiple security systems simultaneously, combined with the lack of any apparent motive for such an elaborate hoax, left even the most knowledgeable experts struggling to provide satisfactory explanations for what had occurred. The story's international reach was facilitated by the universal nature of both missing persons cases and pandemic-related virtual learning experiences. Similar reports began emerging from other countries where remote education had been implemented. Stories of phantom students appearing in virtual classrooms in the United Kingdom, France, and Australia, though none as well documented or credible as Dylan's appearance. These international reports added a global dimension to the mystery while raising questions about whether technological vulnerabilities or psychological phenomena might be creating similar experiences across different cultures and educational systems. The attention brought both desperately needed assistance and unwelcome complications to the Mitchell family's situation. Professional investigators, private detectives, and volunteer search organizations offered their services free of charge, providing resources that the family had never been able to afford during their years of searching for Dylan. However, the media spotlight also attracted fraudsters claiming to have information about Dylan's whereabouts, psychics offering to channel his spirit for a fee, and conspiracy theorists promoting increasingly bizarre explanations for his disappearance and virtual reappearance. More troubling were the copycat incidents that began occurring as the story gained widespread attention. Students in other virtual classrooms reported seeing missing friends or relatives during online classes, though investigation typically revealed these to be hoaxes, perpetrated by people seeking attention or attempting to capitalize on the viral nature of Dylan's story. These false reports created additional work for law enforcement agencies while potentially undermining the credibility of genuine witnesses to Dylan's appearance. The viral nature of the story also attracted the attention of true crime enthusiasts, amateur detectives, and internet sleuths who began conducting their own investigations into Dylan's original disappearance. While some of this crowdsourced detective work provided useful leads and fresh perspectives on cold case evidence, it also generated misinformation, invaded the privacy of innocent people, and created additional emotional stress for the Mitchell family as they tried to distinguish between genuine assistance and exploitation of their tragedy. Social media platforms found themselves grappling with questions about how to moderate content related to the story, balancing the legitimate news value and community support aspects of the viral phenomenon against the need to prevent harassment, misinformation, and exploitation of a family's trauma. The policies developed in response to Dylan's case would later influence how social media companies handled other viral missing person stories and true crime content. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Dylan Mitchell's story reach more people. The FBI's cybercrime division became involved in Dylan Mitchell's case exactly 3 days after his impossible virtual appearance, bringing to Springfield a level of technological expertise and investigative resources that local law enforcement agencies could never have accessed independently. Special Agent Maria Santos, a specialist in digital forensics and online criminal activity with over a decade of experience investigating the darkest corners of the internet, arrived at the Springfield field office with a team of analysts and cutting-edge forensic equipment designed to trace even the most sophisticated attempts to hide illegal activity in cyberspace. Agent Santos's first assessment of the technical evidence was both sobering and deeply disturbing. Her preliminary analysis revealed that Dylan's phantom appearance had required a level of technical sophistication that surpassed most professional hacking operations she had encountered during her career. The intrusion had not only bypassed Zoom's security protocols and the school district's firewall systems, but had also somehow avoided detection by multiple layers of cybersecurity monitoring that should have immediately flagged any unauthorized access attempts. The deeper the FBI's technical analysis proceeded, the more complex and troubling the implications became. Dylan's video feed had been routed through an intricate network of proxy servers spanning multiple countries, utilizing encryption methods that suggested either that Dylan himself had somehow acquired advanced cybersecurity skills during his absence, or that he was being controlled and monitored by individuals with extensive technical knowledge and significant financial resources. The complexity of the digital routing suggested a level of planning and infrastructure that indicated this was not a spontaneous contact attempt, but rather a carefully orchestrated event that had been planned well in advance. Even more disturbing was the quality and characteristics of Dylan's video feed during his brief appearance. Despite the complex routing through multiple international servers, the image quality had been surprisingly clear and stable, suggesting access to professional-grade video equipment rather than the consumer-level webcams typically used for educational video conferencing. The lighting in Dylan's background had been artificial and harsh, consistent with fluorescent or LED lighting systems commonly found in institutional or commercial settings rather than residential environments. The FBI's investigation quickly expanded beyond simple technical analysis to include behavioral assessment and pattern recognition across national databases of missing persons cases and cybercrimes. Agent Santos worked closely with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit to decode Dylan's apparent attempts at communication during his brief virtual appearance, using advanced video enhancement techniques to analyze his lip movements, facial expressions, and body language for clues about his current circumstances and psychological state. The enhanced video analysis revealed disturbing details that had not been apparent to the original witnesses. Dylan's attempts at communication had been more extensive and desperate than initially realized. His lip movements, when slowed down and enhanced, appeared to form not just single words like help or find, but longer phrases that could be interpreted as can't stay long, they watch everything, and possibly Kentucky mountains. His hand gestures, initially dismissed as nervous mannerisms, appeared to be more deliberate when analyzed frame by frame, potentially indicating specific numbers, directions, or locations that he was trying to communicate under circumstances where speaking openly was impossible or dangerous. Most chilling was the analysis of Dylan's eye movements and facial expressions during his virtual appearance. FBI behavioral specialists noted that his gaze frequently shifted off-camera in a pattern consistent with someone monitoring their surroundings for potential threats or oversight. His facial expressions alternated between relief at seeing familiar faces and anxiety that suggested he was aware that his contact attempt was dangerous and could potentially be detected by whoever was controlling his environment. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar phantom appearances that had been reported across the country during the early months of the pandemic, though none had been as clear, well-documented, or extensively witnessed as Dylan's manifestation in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. A missing college student named Jennifer Walsh had allegedly appeared briefly in her former psychology class at Portland State University, visible for less than 30 seconds before her connection terminated. A disappeared father from Jacksonville, Florida, named Robert Chen, had reportedly been seen during his 12-year-old daughter's virtual graduation ceremony, though the sighting lasted only moments and was witnessed by only a few participants. The geographic distribution of these phantom appearances suggested a coordinated phenomenon, rather than isolated incidents or technical glitches. Agent Santos mapped the reported sightings and found that they clustered around major metropolitan areas with significant internet infrastructure, but the actual source locations appeared to be concentrated in rural areas of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. regions with limited law enforcement presence but extensive abandoned mining infrastructure that could potentially provide isolated locations for illegal activities. More disturbing still was the discovery that several of the phantom appearances correlated with missing persons cases that had received minimal media attention or law enforcement resources. The individuals who had allegedly appeared in virtual settings were predominantly young adults from middle-class families, often with some technical skills or educational background that might be valuable to criminal organizations involved in sophisticated cybercrimes. The pattern suggested that these disappearances might not be random incidents, but rather targeted acquisitions of individuals with specific skills or characteristics. Agent Santos's team also investigated the technical signature of Dylan's virtual connection, comparing it with databases of known cybercriminal operations and illegal online activities. The routing patterns and encryption methods used to facilitate Dylan's appearance matched signatures associated with illegal streaming operations, specifically networks that offered exclusive content, featuring missing persons to paying customers who believed they were accessing elaborate fictional entertainment rather than genuine crimes in progress. This discovery led to one of the most disturbing possibilities the investigation had uncovered. Dylan and potentially other missing persons might be being held captive and forced to perform or exist for the entertainment of online audiences who paid premium prices to watch what they believed was sophisticated fiction rather than real human suffering. The pandemic had created new opportunities for such operations to expand their reach by infiltrating legitimate platforms like educational video conferencing systems, exploiting the chaos and technical vulnerabilities of emergency remote learning implementations. The FBI's investigation into these illegal streaming networks revealed a horrifying underground economy that had grown exponentially during the pandemic. Isolated individuals paying for access to reality entertainment that featured missing persons living in controlled environments, their captivity disguised as elaborate performance art or immersive fiction. The audiences believed they were paying for access to cutting-edge virtual reality experiences or interactive entertainment, remaining willfully ignorant of the genuine suffering they were financially supporting. Agent Santos coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to trace the financial networks supporting these operations. Following cryptocurrency transactions and offshore banking systems that had been used to fund the infrastructure necessary for such sophisticated criminal enterprises. The money trail revealed a network of investors and customers spanning multiple countries, suggesting that Dylan's disappearance might be connected to an international human trafficking operation that specialized in acquiring individuals with specific technical skills or demographic characteristics. 2 weeks after Dylan's virtual appearance, Agent Santos made a breakthrough that would fundamentally change the direction of the investigation and provide the first tangible lead in Dylan Mitchell's disappearance in over 5 years. While analyzing the metadata from the Zoom session with specialized FBI forensic software that could detect digital artifacts invisible to standard analysis tools, her team discovered that Dylan's phantom connection had briefly synchronized with a specific cell tower located in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, approximately 300 miles southeast of Springfield. The connection had lasted only seconds and had been immediately rerouted through a complex network of international proxy servers designed to obscure its origin. But the brief synchronization had left a digital fingerprint that could be traced to a geographic area covering roughly 50 square miles of rugged, sparsely populated terrain. The region was characterized by abandoned coal mining operations, dense forest coverage, and minimal law enforcement presence, an ideal location for criminal activities that required isolation and minimal oversight. The Kentucky location was particularly significant because Agent Santos's investigation had revealed that it corresponded with a cluster of missing person cases dating back to 2016. 3 teenagers and 2 young adults had disappeared from various states over the past 4 years, and while their cases had never been officially connected due to different jurisdictions and varying circumstances of disappearance, they had all been last tracked to areas within a 50-mile radius of the cell tower that had briefly carried Dylan's signal. The missing individuals shared several concerning characteristics that suggested their disappearances might not have been random. All were between the ages of 16 and 23, came from middle-class families with limited resources for extensive private investigation, and possessed some level of technical skill or educational achievement that might be valuable to criminal organizations. Most disturbing was the pattern of their disappearances. All had vanished during routine daily activities in ways that suggested careful surveillance and planning rather than opportunistic crimes. Jennifer Martinez, a 19-year-old computer science student, had disappeared from a college campus in Ohio in 2018 after leaving her dorm room to meet someone she had connected with through an online study group. Security cameras had captured her leaving the building willingly with an unidentified individual, but the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned for the crucial 30 minutes when she would have left campus property. Her laptop and technical equipment had remained in her room, suggesting that her departure had been sudden and unplanned. David Park, a 17-year-old high school senior with exceptional mathematics abilities, had vanished from a suburban shopping mall in Indiana in 2019. He had told his parents he was meeting friends at the mall's arcade, but security footage showed him leaving the building alone with someone who appeared to be roughly his own age. His cell phone had been found in a mall bathroom with its SIM card removed and its memory completely wiped, a level of technical sophistication that suggested professional planning. The pattern continued with 3 other cases, each involving young people with technical skills who had disappeared under circumstances that initially appeared voluntary, but revealed signs of careful planning and professional execution upon closer examination. None of the cases had received significant media attention or extensive law enforcement resources, allowing them to remain isolated and unsolved, while potentially being connected to a larger criminal operation. A joint federal task force was assembled immediately upon the discovery of the Kentucky connection, combining FBI cybercrime specialists, federal marshals, Drug Enforcement Administration agents with experience in rural criminal operations, and local law enforcement agencies from Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the investigation had initially complicated information sharing and resource allocation, but Dylan's virtual appearance had provided the breakthrough evidence needed to justify a coordinated federal response. The area identified by the cell tower ping presented significant logistical and legal challenges for law enforcement. The terrain was mountainous and heavily forested, with numerous abandoned mining operations that created a labyrinth of tunnels, buildings, and access roads that could easily conceal illegal activities. Property ownership records were complicated by decades of mining company bankruptcies, land sales, and unclear title transfers that made it difficult to determine which properties could be legally searched and which required complex warrant procedures. Satellite imagery analysis revealed several buildings and compounds within the target area that warranted investigation, but the remote locations and challenging terrain meant that any raid operations would require extensive planning, specialized equipment, and significant personnel resources. The FBI's tactical response teams began preparing for potential operations, while legal specialists worked to secure the warrants necessary for searching properties that might be connected to Dylan's disappearance and the broader pattern of missing persons cases. The most disturbing discovery during the preliminary investigation came when Agent Santos cross-referenced Dylan's virtual appearance with databases maintained by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and international organizations combating human trafficking. The technical signature of his connection, the specific encryption methods, routing patterns, and video compression algorithms used, matched digital fingerprints associated with illegal streaming operations that offered paying customers access to exclusive reality content featuring individuals who had been reported missing. These illegal streaming networks represented a horrifying evolution of human trafficking that exploited both advancing technology and the social isolation created by the pandemic. Criminal organizations were kidnapping individuals with specific skills or characteristics and forcing them to perform daily activities for online audiences who paid premium prices for access to what they believed was sophisticated entertainment rather than genuine criminal activity. The audiences were led to believe they were paying for cutting-edge virtual reality experiences, interactive fiction, or immersive performance art, remaining deliberately ignorant of the real human suffering their money supported. The financial infrastructure supporting these operations was sophisticated and international in scope, utilizing cryptocurrency transactions, offshore banking systems, and complex corporate structures designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. Agent Santos worked with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and international partners to trace money flows that revealed a network of investors and customers spanning multiple countries, suggesting that Dylan's case was connected to a criminal enterprise with global reach and substantial financial resources. The investigation revealed that the pandemic had created unprecedented opportunities for these criminal operations to expand their reach and customer base. The isolation and desperation created by lockdown orders had increased demand for online entertainment, while the technical chaos of emergency remote learning and work-from-home implementations had created vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals could exploit to infiltrate legitimate platforms and reach new audiences. The compound raid took place at dawn on May 15, 2020, exactly 1 month after Dylan Mitchell's impossible appearance in Mrs. Henderson's virtual classroom had shattered his family's acceptance of his loss and set in motion the investigation that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated and disturbing criminal operations in modern American history. Federal agents, state police tactical teams, and specialized rescue units surrounded a collection of buildings hidden deep in the Kentucky wilderness, connected to the outside world only by satellite internet systems and diesel generators that had allowed their occupants to operate beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement detection methods for over 4 years. The compound consisted of 6 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, camouflaged by natural vegetation and designed to appear abandoned from aerial surveillance. The main structure, a converted mining office building from the 1970s, had been extensively renovated with soundproofing, climate control systems, and sophisticated networking equipment that enabled high-quality video streaming and encrypted communications with customers around the world. Smaller buildings served as living quarters, technical equipment storage, and what appeared to be backup facilities designed to ensure operational continuity if the primary location was compromised. What federal agents found inside the compound defied the comprehension of even experienced law enforcement professionals who had investigated the darkest aspects of human cruelty and criminal enterprise. The main building had been converted into a sophisticated broadcasting studio complex with multiple rooms designed to appear like normal residential spaces, but equipped with hidden cameras, professional lighting systems, and streaming equipment that transmitted the daily activities of captive individuals to paying customers who believed they were accessing cutting-edge entertainment rather than witnessing real human suffering. Dylan was found in a room that had been meticulously designed to replicate a typical teenager's bedroom, complete with posters, books, gaming equipment, and furnishings carefully selected to maintain the illusion of normal adolescent life for online viewers who paid premium subscription fees to watch what they believed was an elaborate form of interactive fiction. The room contained hidden cameras positioned to capture every angle of daily activity, microphones sensitive enough to record whispered conversations, and monitoring equipment that tracked sleep patterns, emotional states, and behavioral changes that were packaged as character development for the entertainment of subscribers. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this illusion was as sophisticated as the technical infrastructure supporting it. Dylan and the other captives had been gradually conditioned to perform normal daily activities while being constantly monitored and broadcast to audiences who were led to believe they were watching elaborate performance art or immersive virtual reality experiences. The captives were told that their families believed them dead, that the outside world had forgotten them entirely, and that their only value was as entertainment for strangers who paid to observe their daily existence. The operation was masterminded by Marcus Thornfield, a former technology executive who had disappeared in 2015 after embezzling $12.8 million from Innovative Systems Solutions, a software company he had helped found during the early days of social media development. Thornfield had used his stolen funds and extensive technical expertise to create what he called authentic reality entertainment, a criminal enterprise that kidnapped carefully selected young people and forced them to live broadcasted lives for the twisted entertainment of paying customers who were willing to pay premium prices for access to what they believed was the ultimate in immersive, interactive entertainment. Thornfield's background revealed a gradual descent into criminal behavior that had begun with corporate fraud and evolved into increasingly sophisticated forms of human exploitation. His technical skills, combined with his understanding of human psychology and market demand for novel entertainment experiences, had enabled him to create a criminal operation that generated millions of dollars in revenue while remaining undetected by law enforcement for years. His customers, numbering in the thousands across multiple countries, believed they were paying for access to cutting-edge virtual reality technology and interactive storytelling rather than real human captivity. The captives found at the compound told stories that revealed the horrifying sophistication of Thornfield's psychological manipulation techniques. They had been gradually isolated from reality through a combination of technological deception, psychological abuse, and carefully crafted lies about their families and the outside world. They were told that their disappearances had been dismissed as voluntary departures, that their families had given up searching for them, and that law enforcement had classified them as runaways who were not worth investigating. Dylan's account of his 5 years in captivity revealed the extraordinary psychological strength required to maintain hope and sanity under circumstances designed to break his connection to his previous life and identity. He had been forced to maintain the appearance of normal teenage development and daily activities while being constantly monitored by cameras that broadcast his every moment to subscribers who treated his suffering as entertainment. His captors had told him that his parents had divorced due to the stress of his disappearance, that his sister Emma had been placed in foster care, and that Springfield had essentially forgotten his existence entirely. The most disturbing aspect of Dylan's captivity was the way Thornfield had exploited his intelligence and technical interests to make him complicit in maintaining the streaming operation. Dylan had been gradually trained to perform minor technical maintenance on the broadcasting equipment, told that his cooperation would prevent harm from coming to other captives, and psychologically manipulated into believing that resistance was futile because no one was searching for him anymore. His appearance in the virtual classroom had been an act of extraordinary courage, requiring him to risk severe punishment to briefly hijack the compound's internet connection and insert himself into his former school's system. The rescue operation revealed that Dylan had been planning his virtual appearance for months, carefully studying the compound's network infrastructure and waiting for an opportunity when security protocols might be relaxed due to the chaos surrounding pandemic-related changes in internet usage patterns. He had somehow managed to access the system that normally broadcast his captivity to paying subscribers and redirect that signal to appear in Mrs. Henderson's Zoom classroom, gambling that someone would recognize him and understand that his disappearance had never been voluntary. The other missing persons found at the compound, Jennifer Martinez, David Park, Lisa Chen, Michael Rodriguez, Sarah Thompson, and Amanda Wilson, ranged in age from 17 to 24 and had been held captive for periods ranging from 8 months to over 4 years. Each had been targeted for specific characteristics that made them valuable for Thornfield's illegal streaming operation. Technical skills, attractive appearance, interesting personalities, or educational backgrounds that would appeal to different segments of his customer base. Their physical conditions were relatively good, as Thornfield had understood that maintaining their health and appearance was essential for preserving the quality of his broadcasts and the satisfaction of his paying customers. However, the psychological trauma inflicted on all of the captives was profound and would require extensive therapy and support to address. Years of constant surveillance, psychological manipulation, and complete isolation from their families and previous lives had created complex trauma responses that challenged conventional treatment approaches. The captives had been forced to perform normal life activities under artificial circumstances while being cut off from genuine human connection and authentic emotional expression, creating a form of psychological damage that mental health professionals were still learning to understand and treat. Dylan's reunion with his family, captured by news cameras that had been following the story since his virtual appearance, was simultaneously joyful and heartbreaking. The young man who emerged from the Kentucky compound was recognizable as the teenager who had disappeared 5 years earlier. But he had been fundamentally changed by experiences that no person should have to endure. His parents and sister faced the challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been frozen in time, while Dylan had been forced to continue developing under circumstances that bore no resemblance to normal human growth and development. The investigation into Thornfield's criminal network revealed the full scope of an operation that had generated over $15 million in revenue from subscribers who paid monthly fees ranging from $500 to $5,000 for access to different levels of reality entertainment content. Customers had been located in over 30 countries, with the largest concentrations in the United States, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Most had been led to believe they were paying for access to elaborate fictional experiences or cutting-edge virtual reality technology, though federal investigators suspected that many subscribers had willfully ignored obvious signs that they were witnessing real human captivity. The case revolutionized how law enforcement approached missing person investigations in the digital age, leading to new protocols for investigating disappearances that might be connected to online criminal activity. It also resulted in landmark legislation requiring streaming platforms and social media companies to implement stronger verification procedures for content that featured individuals in domestic or private settings, closing loopholes that had allowed Thornfield's operation to market genuine human suffering as fictional entertainment. Dylan's courage in finding a way to signal for help through a virtual classroom had not only saved his own life and the lives of 6 other captives, but had also exposed a criminal operation that represented a new and particularly heinous form of human trafficking that exploited both advancing technology and the social isolation created by the pandemic. His brief appearance on Mrs. Henderson's computer screen had triggered an investigation that led to the arrest of Marcus Thornfield and 17 associates, the rescue of 7 missing persons, and the identification of thousands of customers who had financially supported human trafficking while believing they were purchasing entertainment. The legal proceedings that followed would establish important precedents for prosecuting crimes that blurred the boundaries between technology, entertainment, and human exploitation. Thornfield was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while his associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years for their roles in the kidnapping and exploitation operation. Many of the customers who had subscribed to the illegal streaming service faced charges related to financial support of human trafficking, even if they claimed ignorance about the real nature of the content they had been purchasing. Dylan Mitchell's story became a catalyst for broader conversations about the ways technology could be exploited to facilitate human trafficking, the responsibility of online platforms to verify the authenticity and ethics of their content, and the need for more sophisticated law enforcement approaches to crimes that transcended traditional geographic and jurisdictional boundaries. His virtual appearance in a high school history class had not only reunited him with his family, but had also shed light on criminal enterprises that thrived in the shadows of legitimate technological advancement. The compound in Kentucky was demolished 6 months after the raid, but the investigation it spawned continued for years as federal authorities worked to identify and prosecute the international network of customers, investors, and facilitators who had made Thornfield's operation possible. Dylan's courage in risking everything to appear in his former classroom had saved not only his own life, but had also prevented countless other young people from becoming victims of a criminal enterprise that treated human suffering as a commodity to be packaged, marketed, and sold to the highest bidder. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Dylan Mitchell's story. See you in the next video.